The Internal Context of Bilingual Processing, Part 2, Answering the Challenge. And this is Mike Sherwood Smith speaking to you from Edinburgh as usual. So, remember last time we talked about shallow and deep explanations, seeing that as a matter of degree, and identified the position that the modular cognition framework takes as halfway, as it were, between the shallow explanations, the convenient, quick research project type explanation that is used very often nowadays for convenience, and the rich, deep theoretical level which delivers extremely interesting explanations. And by way of a sort of research tool, the modular cognition framework can be used to transition between the shallower and the deeper levels. That at least is the ambition. So today I'd like to give some attention to two main things. Most of all, I want to talk a little more about bilingual processing as a particular manifestation of cognitive processing in general, right? So this is all part of the interdisciplinary perspective that the MCF framework is trying to promote. So if we look, for example, at bilingual processing, we don't just look at processing, we look at representation, and we look at either of those two ideas. We look at how the mind in general processes and represents the world reality. And we incorporate that into explanations of specific phenomena, in this case the phenomena of bilingual processing. So it's a mind-wide approach. And what I'm trying to do today is just talk at a very superficial level about some important concepts that will be used when we're talking about bilingual processing in this mind-wide perspective. And as you see, they vary from A to E. So the first one is talking about cognitive representations in the first place. What are they? It's not much use talking about a linguistic representation or a language representation if you don't have a good idea of what representations are in general. Then the next one is memory and activation. These are terms which are regularly used, especially in psycholinguistics, so we need to have a little talk about that. Then cognitive control and goals, which I mentioned last time. Cognitive control, frequently associated with executive functions. The idea of a goal doesn't always see much light, but goals do come up and they're very important, so we ought to talk a little about goals. And then consciousness and attention, which is of course a very deep subject in some sense in philosophical circles. We can't hope to solve the problem of consciousness, certainly that would be arrogant, and indeed some people claim it will never be fully solved, explaining this phenomenon of consciousness, but we can at least try to put it within the framework into some kind of manageable perspective. So I'll deal also with that. And finally, self, which is another thing which is very infrequently used in psycholinguistic studies or representational studies of linguistic structure, at least. Language in general, self does come up, but not really in terms of processing. So we're going to have a look at self. Again, I insist it's at a fairly superficial level, but still helpful, I think. And we go into, we being John Truscott and myself, go into much more detail in our book on the same subject. And the second main point is getting down to brass tacks, as it were, because we are talking about language and not cognition in general exclusively. So how language is processed in the mind, and then I'll go on and talk a little more about this in later presentations. Okay, let's begin with the first main point, the first of two, and that is bilingual processing as a manifestation of cognitive processing in general. So, the first concept was a cognitive representation. What on earth is that? Well, you know, there are two ways of responding. There's a brain answer and a mind answer. A brain answer would be quite difficult, but people have attempted it. And what a cognitive representation is, when you look at neurons, neural structure, brain structure, could be something in the order of a description as given by Antonio Damasio in 1994, when he was talking about what he called dispositional representations. And he said what they are basically a potential pattern of neuron activity in a small ensemble of neurons. So we're talking about neuron activity, and we're talking about an ensemble of neurons. And the question is, are these how localized these are, or how distributed? And probably there are localized aspects and distributed aspects as well. So what we call a cognitive representation, when it is identified in brain patterns, will be neuronal activity, both in specific areas and also distributed across the brain in general. So it'll be a combination of those two. But of course, you know, this is all about the mind and not the brain. So more important for our purposes is, what is the MCF mind answer? And the answer is, for us at least, a cognitive representation is either, perhaps rarely, infrequently, but possibly a single primitive element in the store, right? And a single primitive, what do I mean by primitive? Primitive is essentially what is given to you in advance. So every system has its own primitives, and a primitive representation will be something which will enable you from the very beginning, your first moments of life, to start building a representation in a particular system. So, for example, in the visual system, you will have primitives which allow you to build up visual representations in your mind over the lifetime, and these will be constructed according to principles which are characteristic of human vision. So, in other words, primitives are all part of your biological starter set. Where are they? Well, we have a nice convenience in mind descriptions. We don't have to represent faithfully what representations might be in the brain over a large area. We can abstract away from that, and we can talk about a store. So these elements, whether they're a primitive element or a combination of associated elements, a complex representation as it were, they exist within a particular store in a given cognitive system. Next one up is memory. So memory, everyone knows what memory is, more or less. We talk about it regularly. We remember things, we forget things, we lament our loss of memory in some cases. But in any case, memory in the modular cognition framework is based on these stored representations. So when they're activated, we can talk about memory. So each cognitive system, as I've said, has its own specialized store, its own specialized principles, and that means that when we talk about memory, we should really talk about memories, or different types of memory, because for every single store there is a different type of memory, right? And this way of talking about memory is also reflected in current neuroscience. So when representations in a store become activated, they enter into a state called working memory, right? And there are various approaches to working memory, as I mentioned in the previous presentation. So we have to talk about memory in MCF context as part of working memory. I'll come back to that point in a minute. Cognitive control. What is cognitive control? Well, it's based on a specific goal. Talking about a particular construct, a primitive if you like, in the conceptual system here, and all the representations that are associated with it, because a goal needs to have various associations with different types of representation in order for this goal to be realized, to be achieved. Here's a little diagram to give you a basic idea. Here's a dominant goal here. It may have a number of sub-goals, so we have to talk about a dominant goal. And to achieve this dominant goal, and all of its sub-goals of course, we need to be connected up with, the visual system, the motor system, whatever. And these are a particular network of associations dominated by a goal. And when they're activated, that's how the goal works, right, in a processing context. Now, goals don't necessarily have to be conscious, but as far as cognitive control is concerned, it is frequently associated with consciousness. So you are aware of the goal that you're trying to achieve. As I say, the link between goals and consciousness is not a necessary one, but is very often associated. And to talk about consciousness and attention, let's have a quick look at that. Well, here we are with working memory again, and I've got a diagram here to illustrate it. What conscious experience is within the MCF, it's when a range of representations associated with one another are activated to very high levels. So if you imagine down here this blue area as the representations sitting relatively inactive in their store. I say relatively inactive. When we abstract away from this, we just say they're basically inactive, right? They're not activated. But both in brain and mind accounts, we have to assume that the brain is never totally, that it is always buzzing with some low level of activity. So we can make it to a dichotomy if you like. This is the inactive representations. When they're activated, then they enter into working memory. So all of this area is working memory, and as you see, it can be at a greater or lower level of activation. And when activation takes place at a very high level, then the involved representations are reflected in conscious experience. So conscious experience occurs when a range of representations are activated together at very high levels. So there's some kind of threshold, right, when activation becomes so intense that we start to have conscious awareness. Attention. What is attention? Is it something different? There are certainly accounts where people like to make a distinction between conscious awareness and attention, but not in the modular cognition framework, at least not in this strict dichotomous way. Activation is a broad explainer of all these things. So attention is just one aspect of this activation account. So imagine that you've got a range of currently highly activated representations. They're in that sort of pale yellow area. Particular ones may dominate relative to the others. So attention is where you get this idea of some representations dominating over all the other ones, and that is what we informally and pre-scientifically refer to as attention. So that's what we think is appropriate. Finally, self. Self, again, as I say, is a concept which doesn't occur much in the processing literature, and nevertheless it has to be incorporated into a processing account using the mind-wide perspective that we are using, namely the modular cognition framework. So anyone talking about self usually refers to different categories of self, and in the MCF we've tried to boil them down to three basic types. Right. The first one is the affective self. This is the only self which is processed in the affective system, uniquely in the affective system, and it's associated with basic drives, motivations, emotions, and so forth. And you can see immediately that it's something we share with other species, and the affective self is simply a whole associations of affective representations which correspond to a particular basic drive or emotion. The other two are housed in the conceptual system. For example, there's the goal-based self. I just talked about goals, and a goal-based self, the way you see yourself in terms of goals, means we have a whole mass of these goal representations which represents the individual's self in respect of goals. This is one way of defining yourself, as it were, as in a goal-based way. And finally, there's the meta-self, our concept of self, our personal concept of self, which is also a bundle of composite representations, complex representations, including the concept of me, right? And surrounding me, we have all sorts of representations in the conceptual system which relate to how you view yourself. I am X, I am not X, I'm different, that sort of thing. So that's the third of the basic conceptual, of the basic selves. Okay, now moving on to much closer to what we are basically talking about in this series, namely language. How language is processed in the mind, and here we make a number of two basic distinctions. But it's important first to establish that every language, all language, is processed with the same set of systems. And I'm talking about language in general, and I'm also talking about particular languages. So with bilinguals, multilinguals, you have more than one language. You don't need some kind of extra system. You don't need two lexicons, as it were. You don't have an expansion of the systems. Basically, the same architecture, the same set of systems can handle all of this. And in the MCF, we make a distinction between two basic types of language processing. The first one is a very specific one, which we reserve the name linguistic for. So linguistic structures are processed with, in the MCF at least, two special systems, namely the phonological system and the syntactic system. And together, these handle various types of linguistic structure in any language. So, for example, the syntax of an L1 or an L2 or an L3 will all be processed and represented within the syntactic system, of course, with different interconnections within the system and also with other systems outside, but they'll all be using the same system. Same for phonology. And the second thing, this is non-linguistic structures. So language processing in general is a multi-systemic phenomenon, right? Not just syntax and phonology. That's just the linguistic part, the linguistic structural part. But we're talking here about structures in the auditory system, in the visual system, in the conceptual system, in the affective system, in the motor system. Motor system, of course, is used for articulation, so for language production. And these things all collaborate, as it were, when we're processing language. And it is this second set of non-linguistic systems that we talk about when we're referring to the internal context. So the internal context of linguistic processing, whether it's bilingual, monolingual, or trilingual, or multilingual, the internal context is what's happening in the brain as we process linguistic structure. So it's two when we're processing one, right, if you like. So the internal context of bilingual processing is what's happening in all these various non-linguistic systems, which will affect what eventually gets prominence, how a series of utterances are processed. It's not just the linguistic structures that do it, but all of these things impact on it. That's why it's called context. And that brings me to the end. As I said, it's very much a whistle-stop tour through these rather important concepts. And as I said, we go into it in much more detail in the book of the same name. Next time, again, moving much more closely into the area of bilingual processing and bilingual representation, I'll look at the assumptions and principles of the MCF as applied to this particular area of our interest. So I hope that you join me next time and look at what I have to say and hear what I have to say using your auditory and visual systems and all the other ones, of course, next time. So I'll say goodbye.